Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
The air in Tracy Quartermain's private office at General Hospital was thick with the scent of old money and new anxiety. It was a space that had witnessed decades of corporate machinations, family betrayals, and triumphant, if often ruthless, business coups. For Tracy, this room was not just an office, it was a throne room, a war room, and a sanctuary all in one. The polished mahogany of her desk gleamed under the soft, focused light of a Tiffany lamp, a stark contrast to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon of her life. She stood by the large window, looking down at the bustling streets of Port Charles, but she wasn't really seeing them. Her mind was a whirlwind of fragmented conversations, unexplained occurrences, and a gnawing, persistent dread that had taken root in the pit of her stomach. It had all started with the arrival of Roger. No, that wasn't right. It had started with the absence of Luke. Her brother, her perpetual nemesis and occasional co-conspirator, had vanished again, leaving one of his characteristic voids in the universe. And into that void had stepped Roger, a man who seemed to carry the ghost of Luke Spencer in his every mannerism, his every cynical smile, his every perfectly timed, world-weary quip. He was a drifter, a charmer, a storyteller with a past as murky as the Hudson River. And Tracy, against her better judgment and every instinct honed by a lifetime of being swindled, betrayed, and emotionally looted by the men in her life, had let him in. He had been a diversion at first, a charming distraction from the endless, soul-crushing bureaucracy of running ELQ and managing the endlessly needy Quartermain clan. Roger was uncomplicated. He made her laugh. He didn't want her money, or at least, he didn't seem to want it in the grasping, desperate way she was accustomed to. He wanted her company, her sharp wit, her formidable presence. He made her feel seen, not as a Quartermain, but as Tracy. And in that, he had been more dangerous than any corporate raider or gold-digging suitor. But the cracks had begun to show. Small things, at first. A turn of phrase that was too specific, a knowledge of a long-forgotten incident from Luke's past that a stranger couldn't possibly know. He would get a distant look in his eyes when certain topics arose, a flicker of something old and pained that seemed to belong to a much deeper history than a simple drifter could possess. Tracy, the master of suspicion, had brushed them aside, attributing them to her own loneliness, her own desperate desire for a connection to the one man who had ever truly understood the chaotic symphony of her soul, even if he had also been its most frequent conductor of chaos. Then came the bigger things. The way he could navigate the Quartermain mansion blindfolded. The uncanny ability to predict Edward's, her late father's, favorite brand of whiskey or the location of Lila's, her mother's, hidden rose garden journal. He had stories about places he shouldn't have known, people he couldn't have met. He spoke of a carnival in Canada with a familiarity that was intimate, not anecdotal. Her family had noticed. Ned, her son, with his own history of performance and disguise, had watched Roger with a professional, skeptical eye. "There's something off about him, Mother," he'd said, his voice laced with a concern that Tracy had willfully misinterpreted as condescension. "He's a little too polished. A little too perfect for you." "Don't be ridiculous, Ned," she had snapped back, the defensiveness in her voice a telltale sign that she harbored the same fears. "Not every man in my life has to pass your tedious litmus test for respectability. Perhaps I'm tired of respectable men. They're so often boring." But Ned's words had planted a seed. And seeds, in the fertile, paranoid soil of Tracy Quartermain's mind, had a way of growing into monstrous, tangled vines. She began to test him. She would mention obscure details from Luke's life, watching Roger's face for a flicker of recognition. She would leave old photographs lying around, a picture of Luke and Bobby from the 1970s, a shot of him and Laura from their first wedding. Roger's eyes would linger on them a second too long, his commentary a little too vague, a little too carefully constructed. The dread intensified, coiling itself around her heart like a serpent. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ornate ceiling of her bedroom, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in the darkness. The voice. The laugh. The way he held a deck of cards. The absolute, unshakable comfort he seemed to have in her world, a world that should have been alien and intimidating to a man like Roger. The final straw, the one that broke the back of her denial, was a seemingly innocuous comment about the haunted star. They had been discussing gambling boats, and Roger had offhandedly mentioned a structural quirk in the ship's engine room, a quirk that Luke had discovered during one of his many schemes and had only ever mentioned to a handful of people. Tracy had frozen, her champagne flute halfway to her lips. Her blood, which a moment before had been warm with alcohol and affection, ran cold. "That's an oddly specific piece of trivia," she had said, her voice dangerously calm. Roger had simply shrugged, a lazy, Luke-like gesture. "You hear things on the docks." But Tracy was no longer listening. The walls of her delusion were crumbling, and through the dust and debris, a terrifying, impossible truth was beginning to emerge. She had to know. She could no longer live in this gilded cage of uncertainty. Which is what led her to this moment, standing in her office, holding a single, slender key. It was the key to Luke's old safety deposit box, one he had given her years ago in case of emergencies or a really good scam. She had never used it. She had never wanted to know what secrets it held. But now, it felt like the only key to her own sanity. Her hands trembled as she inserted it into the lock of a small, fireproof box she had retrieved from the depths of her own closet. This was her personal archive of Luke, a collection of items too painful or too confusing to display. Inside, nestled amid old letters and faded ticket stubs, was what she was looking for, a sealed manila envelope. On the front, in Luke's messy scrawl, were the words, "For the nosy sister, don't open unless I'm dead or you're bored." Probably both. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't bored. She was terrified. With a deep, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm her, she broke the seal and slid the contents onto her desk. There were old passports. Driver's licenses from states she'd never heard of. A birth certificate for a Lucas Jones. And photographs. Dozens of them. Luke in various disguises throughout the years, with different hairstyles, different clothes, different personas. There was Lucky, the carny. There was Lars, the Swedish art dealer. And then, her eyes fell on one particular photograph, tucked away in a separate compartment. It was more recent. It showed Luke, but not Luke. His face was different, softer somehow, the lines less deeply etched. The hair was darker, the posture less assured. It was a blueprint for a new identity. And scrawled on the back, in that same familiar handwriting, was a single name, Ronnie. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs as if she'd been punched. Ronnie. Roger. The phonetic similarity was a sick joke. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a confession. All the pieces, the voice, the mannerisms, the knowledge, the eerie comfort, they all slammed together in a single, devastating moment of clarity. Roger was Luke. Luke was Ronnie. The man she had let into her home, into her confidence, into the fragile, guarded chambers of her heart, was not a charming stranger. He was her brother. He had been lying to her, deceiving her, playing her for a fool for weeks, for months. He had watched her lower her defenses, had listened to her private fears and hopes, had shared her bed, and all the while, he had been wearing a mask carved from the very essence of the man who had spent a lifetime driving her to the brink of madness. A high-pitched ringing started in her ears, drowning out the hum of the city below. The photograph of Ronnie slipped from her numb fingers, fluttering down to land face up on the Persian rug. Her vision began to tunnel, the edges darkening, the rich details of her office fading into a blur of nauseating color. The mahogany desk, the shelves of leather-bound books, the portrait of her father, they all swam together in a dizzying vortex. She stumbled back from the window, her hand groping for the edge of the desk to steady herself. Her fingers, slick with a cold sweat, slipped on the polished wood. The betrayal was not a sharp, clean cut, it was a slow, crushing weight, pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. It was the ultimate con. Not for money, not for power, but for, what? For sport? For the sheer, twisted pleasure of proving he could still do it? To see how far his nosy sister would go for a glimpse of the brother she claimed to despise but secretly adored? Memories, now tainted and grotesque, flashed before her eyes. The intimate dinners. The whispered conversations in the dark. The way she had felt a connection, a spark she hadn't felt in years. It had all been a lie. A meticulously constructed, cruel, and elaborate lie. She had been the mark in Luke Spencer's final, most personal con. A broken, choked sound escaped her lips, a hybrid of a sob and a gasp. No! She whispered to the empty room, the word a fragile plea against the crushing truth. It can't be. But it was. The evidence was lying at her feet, smiling up at her with Luke's/Roger's/Ronnie's eyes. The deception was so complete, so profound, that it felt like the very foundations of her reality were giving way. Who was she, if she could be so completely fooled? What was their entire history, if it could culminate in this heartless, psychological violation? The darkness at the edges of her vision surged forward, swallowing the light. The ringing in her ears became a deafening roar. Her legs, once so strong and capable of holding her up through boardroom battles and family crises, turned to water. She felt a terrifying lightness, a disconnect between her mind and her body. Luke! She breathed, his name a final, agonized accusation. And then, the world went black. Tracy Quartermaine, the iron matriarch, the unshakable force of nature, crumpled. Her body folded gracefully, tragically, onto the floor, her head coming to rest mere inches from the photograph that had shattered her world. The only sound in the opulent, silent office was the soft rustle of her silk blouse as she fell, a tiny, insignificant noise to mark the collapse of a fortress of a heart. She did not know how long she lay there in the cool, silent darkness. Time became a fluid, meaningless concept. Consciousness returned not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, painful tide washing over a battered shore. The first sensation was the thick, expensive wool of the Persian rug against her cheek. The second was a profound, bone-deep ache, not a physical injury from the fall, but the somatic echo of a psychic wound. Her eyelids fluttered open. The ornate pattern of the rug filled her vision, a dizzying array of burgundy and gold swirls. For a blissful, fleeting second, there was only confusion. Why was she on the floor? Had she fallen asleep? Then, like a dam breaking, the memory returned, a torrent of devastating clarity. Roger. Luke. Ronnie. The photograph. The betrayal. A low moan escaped her, the sound alien and weak in her own ears. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her body feeling heavy and uncooperative. The room spun lazily around her, the bookshelves and paintings tilting at nauseating angles. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the vertigo to pass, but the sickness in her stomach remained, a churning mix of horror, humiliation, and a grief so sharp it felt like a physical blade twisting in her gut. Her gaze fell upon the photograph of Ronnie. It was still there, lying where it had fallen, its glossy surface seeming to mock her. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering just above it, as if afraid it might burn her. She couldn't bring herself to touch it. It was evidence of her own stupidity, a monument to her profound and utter gullibility. All those conversations. She had told Roger things. Private things. She had spoken about her fears of growing old alone, her frustrations with her family, her complicated, aching love for Luke himself. She had shared stories about their childhood, about the good times that were so often overshadowed by the bad. She had, in her loneliness, offered up the most vulnerable parts of her history to the very man who had been the architect of so much of its pain. And he had listened. He had nodded. He had comforted her. All while knowing. Always knowing. The humiliation was a hot, crawling sensation under her skin. How he must have laughed at her. How he must have relished the performance, savoring every moment of her unwitting confession. Was this his revenge for some long-forgotten slight? Was it his twisted way of reconnecting? Or was it simply Luke being Luke, incapable of a straightforward, honest interaction, forever trapped in the funhouse mirror of his own deceptions? Tears, hot and shame-filled, welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying was a concession. Crying meant he had won. With a surge of furious energy, she grabbed the photograph, crumpling it in her fist. The paper fought back, the glossy stalk resistant to her anger. She wanted to tear it to shreds, to burn it, to erase it from existence. But she couldn't. It was proof. It was the key to confronting him. The thought of confronting him sent a fresh wave of dizziness through her. What would she even say? What words could possibly contain the magnitude of this betrayal? How could you? It was too trite, too small. Why? The answer was likely just as convoluted and unsatisfying as Luke himself. She managed to pull herself up, using the desk for support. Her legs were still unsteady. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She looked pale, her usually sharp features softened by shock, her eyes wide and haunted. She looked like a victim. The sight fueled her anger, burning away some of the shock and grief. Tracy Quartermaine was nobody's victim. Not even Luke Spencer's. A plan, raw and desperate, began to form in her mind. She couldn't let him get away with this. She couldn't allow him to simply vanish back into the ether, leaving her to pick up the pieces of her shattered pride. She had to face him. She had to look him in the eye, not as Roger, not as Ronnie, but as Luke, and make him acknowledge what he had done. But first, she needed to be sure. Absolutely, unequivocally sure. The photograph and the documents were compelling, but they were circumstantial. She needed irrefutable evidence. She needed to hear it from him, to see the mask slip in real time. She stumbled to her desk chair and collapsed into it, her mind racing, plotting with a cold, clinical precision that was a welcome respite from the emotional maelstrom. She would not react with hysterics. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would be smarter than that. She would be Tracy Quartermaine, the chess master, not Tracy, the heartbroken fool. She reached for her phone, her hand still trembling slightly. She took a deep, steadying breath, forcing her voice into a neutral, even pleasant, register. She dialed the number she had for Roger. It rang twice before he picked up. Well, hello there, his voice came through the line, warm and familiar. It was Luke's voice. How had she not seen it? How had she not heard it? The timbre, the slight gravelly undertone, the way he drawled his vowels, it was all him. The realization was another fresh stab of pain. Roger, she said, pleased at how calm she sounded. I was hoping you could stop by the office. There's something I'd like to discuss with you. She kept her tone light, inviting. I've come across some fascinating old Quartermaine documents. I think you'd find them very interesting. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. A fraction of a second too long. Old documents, you say? He replied, his voice still easy, but she detected a new wariness beneath the surface. Sounds dusty. Do I need to bring my own decoder ring? Just your charming self, Tracy said, a brittle smile on her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Shall we say in an hour? An hour it is, he agreed. Wouldn't miss it for the world. She hung up the phone, the plastic casing creaking under the pressure of her grip. The die was cast. The stage was set. The next act in their lifelong, toxic drama was about to begin. The hour that stretched before her was an eternity of agony. Every tick of the ornate grandfather clock in the corner was a hammer blow to her nerves. She rehearsed what she would say in her mind, a dozen different scripts, each one ending with her unleashing the full force of her fury and pain upon him. But each scenario felt inadequate. Words were insufficient vessels for this kind of betrayal. She busied herself with the pretense of work, straightening the papers on her desk, aligning a pen with obsessive precision. But her eyes kept drifting back to the crumpled photograph she had shoved into her desk drawer. It felt like a live wire, humming with malevolent energy. She thought about all the times Roger had been in this very office. Leaning against the bookshelf, his arms crossed, offering a cynical comment on corporate strategy. Sitting in the chair opposite her, listening intently as she vented about Monica or argued with Ned. Standing right where she had stood, by the window, pointing out some absurdity on the street below. The room was now haunted by his ghost, a ghost that was, in fact, very much alive and perpetually laughing at her. The knock on the door, when it finally came, was firm and confident. It was his knock. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, panicked bird. For a terrifying moment, she considered not answering. She could pretend she wasn't there. She could let him leave, and she could spend the rest of her life trying to forget this ever happened. But that was the coward's way out. And Tracy Quartermain was no coward. "Come in," she called out, her voice miraculously steady. The door opened, and there he was. Roger. He was dressed in his usual casual, slightly rumpled style, a leather jacket thrown over a simple t-shirt. He wore a small, easy smile, but his eyes, those damnably familiar blue eyes, were sharp, scanning the room, scanning her. He could always sense a shift in the atmosphere, like a shark sensing blood in the water. "You summoned, Almighty Quartermain," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He moved with Luke's loose-limbed grace, a prowl disguised as a saunter. "You said something about dusty documents. I hope this isn't your idea of a hot date." Tracy remained seated behind her desk, using it as a barrier, a fortress wall. She folded her hands in front of her, hoping he couldn't see the fine tremor in her fingers. "It's about a discovery I made," she began, her gaze locked on his. "A rather personal discovery." His smile didn't falter, but something shifted in his eyes. A veil came down, a subtle tightening. "Personal discoveries are my favorite kind. More interesting than stock portfolios and land deeds. I found something in an old box of my brother's things," she continued, her voice dropping, becoming quieter, more deliberate. She watched him, searching for the crack in the facade. "My brother, Luke. You remember me talking about him?" "Of course," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "The legendary Luke Spencer. The man, the myth, the perpetual headache. Hard to forget." "He was a man of many faces," Tracy said, picking up a single, uncrumpled passport from the desk. It was one of the older ones, from the Lars Identity. She didn't look at it, she kept her eyes on him. He had a talent for reinvention. For becoming someone else entirely. He found a kind of freedom in it, I think. Or maybe just a way to escape the messes he made. Roger's posture was still relaxed, but she saw the minute tension in his jaw. "Sounds like a complicated guy." "The most complicated," she agreed. She put down the Lars passport and picked up another. "Lucky, the Carney." She held it up for a moment, then placed it neatly beside the first. He would create these entire lives for himself. Backstories, habits, even new voices. He was a brilliant performer. The best I've ever known. She was building a pattern on the desk, a gallery of Luke's ghosts. Roger's eyes flicked down to the passports, then back to her face. His smile was still there, but it was becoming strained, a painted-on grin. "And the strange thing is," Tracy went on, her voice now barely above a whisper, "he never could quite leave his old self behind. Little pieces of Luke would always bleed through. A turn of phrase. A specific piece of knowledge. A way of laughing. No matter how deep he buried himself, the real Luke Spencer was always there, lurking just beneath the skin. The air in the room was electric. The pretense of casual conversation was gone, replaced by a taut, silent battle of wills. Roger straightened up, no longer leaning on the doorframe. He took a step further into the room. "Tracy," he said, and his voice had lost its Roger lightness. It was deeper, more direct. It was Luke's voice, stripped of its artifice. "Where is this going?" "It's going here," she said, her own composure beginning to fracture. The anger, the hurt, the weeks of deception, they were rising in her throat, threatening to choke her. She yanked open the desk drawer and pulled out the crumpled photograph of Ronnie. She didn't smooth it out. She just slammed it down on the desk, the crumpled image facing him. She looked up at him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and profound pain. "It's going right there, Luke." There was a long, deafening silence. He didn't deny it. He didn't look surprised. He simply looked at the photograph, then back at her, his expression unreadable. The mask was off. The performance was over. Roger was gone, and in his place stood her brother, exposed and finally silent. The confirmation was worse than the suspicion. Seeing the shift in his posture, the subtle realignment of his features from Roger back to Luke, was a visceral, physical blow. All her remaining hope that she was wrong, that she was crazy, evaporated into the tense air between them. "Tracy," he began again, his voice low. "Don't," she cut him off, her voice cracking. She shot to her feet, her hands gripping the edge of the desk for support. "Don't you dare say my name. Don't you dare speak to me. All this time. All this time." The words were torn from her, a raw, wounded cry. "You looked me in the eye. You listened to me. You let me believe." She couldn't finish. The humiliation was too complete. She turned away from him, unable to bear the sight of him, this stranger who was her brother, this betrayer who wore a face she had loved and hated for a lifetime. "Why, Luke?" she whispered, her back to him, her shoulders shaking. "For God's sake, why? Was it a game? Was it a joke? Were you that bored? Or do you just hate me that much?" She heard him take a step closer. "Tracy, look at me." "I can't," she cried, whirling back around, tears now streaming freely down her face, all attempts at control gone. "I can't look at you. Because I don't know who I'm looking at. Are you Roger? Are you Ronnie? Or are you just Luke Spencer, the most heartless, selfish son of a bitch to ever walk the earth?" Her body was trembling uncontrollably. The room began to swim again. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving behind a crushing wave of physical and emotional exhaustion. The edges of her vision started to flicker, the familiar warning signs of another faint. "Tracy?" Luke's voice held a note of genuine alarm now. He took another step forward, his hand outstretched. "Hey, are you okay?" The concern in his voice, so familiar and so utterly false in this context, was the final straw. It was the most grotesque part of the charade. To be deceived was one thing, to be pitted by your deceiver was another. "Don't touch me," she gasped, stumbling backward. Her legs gave way. The strength simply fled her body. The last thing she saw was his face, Luke's face, filled with a shocking, and perhaps real, look of panic as he lunged forward to catch her. But he was too late. For the second time that day, the world dissolved into nothingness. Tracy Quartermain collapsed into a heap on the floor of her office, the victim of a truth too devastating to bear, lying unconscious at the feet of the brother who had, once again, shattered her world. The confrontation was over. The truth was out. But the devastating aftermath was only just beginning. The fallout from this revelation would ripple through the Quartermain family, through the entire fabric of Port Charles, leaving nothing and no one untouched. The game was over. Now came the reckoning. Tracy Quartermain was in the middle of one of her usual high society tirades at the Quartermain mansion when the first crack in her composure began to show. She had been pacing near the fireplace, holding a brandy glass, muttering about ELQ shares and how the family was slowly losing control. Ned had tried to calm her, but she was too fired up. "Don't you tell me to relax, Ned," she snapped, slamming the glass down on the bar cart. "I've spent half my life keeping this family together while everyone else treats it like a revolving door of chaos." Ned sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mother, you're going to give yourself a heart attack if you keep this up." Tracy glared at him. "I'll survive. It's the rest of you I'm worried about." But her rant was cut short when Brooklyn rushed in, her face pale, holding her phone tightly. "Grandmother, you need to sit down," Brooklyn said, her voice shaking. "We found out something about Ronnie." Tracy turned sharply, her expression hardening. "What about him? Don't tell me he's another one of those no-good men who thinks he can play both sides." Brooklyn hesitated, her lips trembling. "It's not that simple. Grandma. Ronnie isn't who he says he is." Tracy blinked, confused. "What in the world are you talking about? He's been working with Brooklyn and Blaze, right? Handling publicity for the tour?" Brooke nodded slowly, glancing toward Ned, who looked equally puzzled. "He is, but that's not all. Dante did some digging after that weird run-in at the docks. It turns out Ronnie's not really Ronnie. Tracy's brows furrowed. Well then, who the hell is he? Brooke's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, he's not Ronnie Domestico at all. He's someone else, someone from our past. For a long moment, silence filled the mansion. The clock ticked loudly in the background, echoing the tension. Tracy's voice dropped to a near whisper. Don't toy with me, Brooklyn. I want the truth. Ned stepped closer, his tone cautious. Brooke, you're scaring her. Just say it. Brooklyn swallowed hard and said, his real name is Ronald Ashton, he's connected to the Ashtons. He's your cousin, grandmother. Edward's illegitimate grandson. Tracy froze. Her hands trembled as she took a step back. What? She breathed, her voice thin. That's impossible. Edward had his share of secrets, but another Ashton? Brooke nodded. Dante confirmed it. DNA test and everything. Tracy's face went pale. Oh, for heaven's sake, you can't mean to tell me Edward cheated on Mary May Ward's friend and produced another child? Another one we didn't know about? Ned exchanged a worried glance with Brooke. It looks that way, he said softly. Apparently, this Ronnie, or Ronald, has been hiding in plain sight. He's been working with people in Port Charles for months, trying to get close to the Quartermaines. Tracy stumbled toward the couch, gripping the armrest. He's been here, in my home, drinking my coffee, smiling at my face, her voice cracked, and her hand went to her chest. And all this time, he's been a reminder of my father's mistakes? Brooklyn rushed to her side. Grandma, breathe, okay? We just wanted you to know before it came out in the press. But Tracy was barely hearing her. Her mind was spinning, memories flashing back of Edward's endless string of secrets, the countless illegitimate heirs that seemed to pop up like weeds over the decades. Why now? Tracy muttered. Why would he show up now, after all these years? What does he want from us? Ned crouched beside her. Maybe he doesn't want anything. Maybe he just wants to know where he comes from. Tracy scoffed. Oh, please. Nobody just wants to know where they come from in this family. They want money, power, or a piece of ELQ. That's all it ever is.